The Good Samaritan. Who has not heard of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke 10? Who has not been told that the parable calls us to love our neighbors as the Samaritan loves, in a disinterested manner, those in distress? And is the parable not teaching us that our deeds are the path leading to eternal life? But now, is there anything really extraordinary about that message? What is peculiarly biblical about it? A close reading of Luke, one that accords with Jesus' own counsel on reading as returning to the author's own mind, suggests that much has yet to be discovered in our parable. The phenomenological sermon proposed here invites the reader to journey back to the heart of Luke's celebrated story, perhaps even to the other side of the path trodden by fallen men who take for granted our common human condition. With the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus takes up eupolambon, the question, and who is my neighbor? The question had been asked by an expert in law, a nomikos, who sought to justify himself. Thus the question is really about what makes something right, or what justifies one's judgment about something. What is the ground of right? Is it the law or something else? Jesus is answering this question and none other. His interlocutor had appealed to the law and provided a correct reading of it. Jesus had confirmed. You have answered correctly, he says. Orthos apokrithes. What is written in the law and how, pos, in Greek, we read the law, are two conjoined questions where reading, anagignoskein, entails returning to the mind of the author, almost remembering, as in Plato's anamnesis. What the law says is a question inseparable from the path leading back to the actual content or message or spirit of the law. Here again, Luke's terms point back to the ground of legal correctness or orthodoxy, questioning literal accounts of the law as inseparable from interpretation. Jesus is calling the expert of law, or lawyer, to recognize that the law is irreducible to its letter, extending between interpretation, human mind, life, and eternal life. The expert had asked about the practical conditions for inheriting eternal life. The verb poieo is brought into play, suggesting that eternal life is inherited thanks to our works, our doings. In the verb inherit, kleronomeo, nomeo, allotting, anticipates dikaio, making right. But are our works the ground for justice, for our being allotted our lot, kleronomos? What must I do to partake in eternal life? Is participation achieved through my works, The expert of law, the nomikos, asks Jesus, the practical teacher, the didaskalos, or teacher of life, about the meaning of the term of the law. Is that meaning or spirit compatible with the letter of the law recited by the legal expert? The legal expert seeks to justify his own role and thus save the letter of the law. He asks, "Who is my neighbor?" having already asked, "What is written in the law?" The message of the law may be one with the interpretation, or our way back to the mind of the author. But the legal expert still needs to account for the letter, or to spell out the spirit. He does so by asking about the identity of the neighbor that I am to love as myself, even as all of my love is directed toward God. If I love myself only in God, how am I to love my neighbor? I am to love him as I love myself, namely by loving him in God, not as my neighbor is outside of God, but as he is or shall be in eternity, or insofar as he partakes in eternal life. What is lovable about my neighbor? Only what partakes in eternal life. I can love myself justly only by loving God. To the extent that I do not empty myself in God, I should not love myself. Now, the same should be said about my neighbor, whom I should love according to the same criteria I adopt for myself. For my neighbor is lovable only in the respect that he mirrors God. It is then God himself who justifies or grounds us rather than our own works. What are we to do? Attribute our doings to God. Place our own authority, our heart, our soul, our strength, our mind, as Luke points out, in God. Do this, and you shall live. Tutopoiei kai zesi. Where our mortal life is participation in or journey to God's eternal life, just as reading is an ascending journey into the author's mind. It is through a parable that Jesus helps the legal expert account for the letter of the law, thereby implying that in practical terms, law can never justify itself. We have no legal justification of the law. We do have, however, a pre-legal justification, or what philosophers might call a natural justification. In our parable, a man, anthropos, probably a Jew, but not considered here as such, took down the path from the capital Jerusalem to Jericho through the desert. And in the desert he was robbed of all his clothes, beaten, and left stranded, half dead. The man was thus stripped of all conventional attributes. Judging from his appearance, a passerby could not know if he was a Jew or not, but only that he was a man, an anthropos. Now, coaccidentally, kata synkurian, A priest was going down, katebainem, which entails a katabasis, a descent, echoing Jesus' upstream upolambano. He was going down that same road, thus distancing himself from Jesus. Having seen the man as man, the priest passed on the opposite side of the road, or rather set his course against that of the man. He thus saw the man as man, the mere anthropos, as an enemy, insofar as the man was not recognizable in legal terms. The letter of the law did not allow the priest to see God in his neighbor, stripped of all visible signs of citizenship. Thereupon, a Levite, assistant to the priest, arrived at the place, kataton topon, where the derelict lay, and passed to the opposite side. Of the priest it is not said that he stopped in any way in the place, kataton topon, where the victim lay. So the Levite has a slight advantage over the priest with respect to what is right. The priest is radical in his separation between what is lawful and what is merely natural, as philosophers might put it. For the priest, law and nature are radically opposed to one another, so that each must go its own way, even if this means that law loses all natural support, alienating itself from nature as it departs from the capital of the law. But then, a journeying Samaritan came to the wounded, not merely to his place, seeing him naturally as a man and so in feelings. The Samaritan here is not a man of law, but a pagan whose conventions are very much transparent to our common humanity. He can easily see that there is dignity within human nature, even prior to the laws showing us that dignity. Precisely by not knowing the good law of Jews, the Samaritan can sense God within man, as opposed to conceiving God above man. Thereupon, the Samaritan cures the wounded man in a ritualistic manner with oil and wine, suggesting that the priestly sacraments of purification find their rudimentary guise in paganism, which shelters men from the desert of violence in which, since Adam, fallen man as such, finds himself at birth. The pagan shelter is an inn rather than a temple, and the Samaritan's concerns, he was concerned, epimelethe, about the wounded, are not full-fledged care of the soul, but Jesus is pointing beyond any overt temple and care. His Samaritan stands as natural anticipation of God himself, who shelters fallen man by commissioning his innkeeper to watch out for him, to retain concern for him, as the reappearing verb epimeleomai indicates. The Samaritan pays 2 dinars to the innkeeper, or he who welcomes every man, literally, so that fallen man can recover his strength in anticipation of the Samaritan's return. Then the Samaritan will amply reimburse the innkeeper for any expense he will have incurred in helping the wounded or fallen man recover. And here we see a parallel with God, who will return to compensate those who help the fallen. In thus ending his parable, Jesus turns to the legal expert to ask him about the identity of the neighbor in the context of the parable. Once again, the expert gives the correct answer, defining the neighbor in terms of doing. The verb poieo returns, what is merciful toward man as man. Now, this doing harkens back to the original question concerning works that lead to eternal life. What is it that we are to do? We are to place ourselves in God, our true place, as opposed to the place in which we have fallen as men, stripped of outward signs of divinity or of our divine mandate. And we are to love our neighbor for God's sake, just as we love ourselves in God. In other words, we are to recognize our neighbor as a sign of God. Yet, Jesus' last question points to a further point. For Jesus' neighbor now is not, grammatically speaking, the one we must help, but the one who helps. Who is the neighbor we must love as ourselves? It is the Good Samaritan. Why? Not because he is a priest or a priest's assistant, but because he is a natural image of God. Jesus has taken up the question of meaning by showing that priests can take it down or away from the source of law, from the center of law. When this happens, we should look at noble pagans to see in them, beyond the orao that the Samaritan, the priest, and the Levite all share, that scene. See in them, then, the sign of God's providence. Indeed, the three characters of the parable must somehow converge in their calling, all the more where we come to see ourselves in our fallen condition as the man who was taking the path down from the eternal city.